Before we begin, we want to thank Marnie, who suggested tonight's topic. This one is yours. We also want to say thank you to Darren, who supported the channel on Buy Me a Coffee. Darren, that genuinely helps, and we truly appreciate it. Now settle in. Tonight we're going to walk through one of the great unfinished mysteries of medieval history, and then, slowly and carefully, we're going to step past the edge of the historical record into the conspiracy theory that grew up in the empty space beyond it. I will tell you clearly when we cross that line. Everything in the first part of this story is documented. Everything after the line is a story people tell, a theory, a piece of speculative fiction built on a true foundation. There is no evidence that the conspiracy described tonight is real. That is part of what makes it such a good story to fall asleep to. You do not have to believe a word of it. You only have to let it carry you. Let us begin where the money begins. The Kingdom of France at the opening of the 14th century was, on paper, the most powerful realm in Christendom. It had the largest population in Europe. It had the finest cathedrals, the most celebrated university, and a monarchy that had spent 200 years quietly absorbing the territories of its rivals. Its king was Philip IV, known to history as Philip the Fair, a name that referred to his appearance rather than his character, and which historians have been enjoying the irony of ever since. Philip was tall, pale, and famously expressionless. One contemporary described him as neither a man nor a beast, but a statue. He rarely raised his voice. He rarely explained himself. He surrounded himself with lawyers rather than knights, men trained in Roman law who could construct an argument for almost anything, and he had a habit of pursuing a goal for years without ever announcing that he was pursuing it. He also had a problem that no amount of stillness could solve. France was broke. The wars had done it. There had been fighting in Flanders, fighting in Gascony, a long and expensive struggle with the English crown, and a disastrous defeat at a place called Courtrai, where an army of French knights had been cut apart by Flemish townsmen armed with pikes. Wars in the 14th century did not run on strategy. They ran on silver. Every knight had to be paid, every horse fed, every siege engine built and carted and rebuilt, and every mercenary crossbowman convinced that this particular king was good for the money. Philip was not good for the money. So he did what desperate governments have always done. He experimented. He debased the coinage, mixing cheaper metal into the silver so that each coin was worth less than its face value, which is a very old trick and one that people notice within about a season. When Paris rioted over the resulting inflation, the king had to take shelter, and the place he took shelter in is one of the small ironies that historians love. He sheltered in the Temple, the fortified Paris headquarters of the Knights Templar, the strongest building in the city. He expelled the Lombard bankers and seized their assets. He expelled the Jewish population of France in the summer of 1306, arresting them in a single coordinated dawn operation across the entire kingdom and confiscating their property and the debts owed to them. Remember that operation. Remember how it was done. Sealed orders, a single day. Total surprise. Philip had run this play before and it had worked, and it had refilled the treasury for a little while, and still it was not enough. Which brings us to the largest creditor of all. To understand what the Templars had become by 1307, you have to understand what they had started as, because the distance between those two things is one of the strangest arcs in medieval history. The order began around the year 1119, in the aftermath of the First Crusade, when a handful of French knights approached the King of Jerusalem with an unglamorous proposal. Pilgrims travelling from the coast up to the Holy City were being robbed and killed on the roads. These knights offered to protect them. They took vows of poverty, chastity and obedience, and they were given quarters in the captured Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, a site believed at the time to stand on the ruins of the Temple of Solomon. That is where the name comes from, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ, and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights of the Temple, the Templars. There were by tradition 9 of them at the start, 9 men, a borrowed hall, a road to police. Within 200 years they would hold property in every kingdom in Western Europe, command fleets, garrison castles, advise popes, and hold the personal savings of kings. The transformation happened for two reasons, and neither of them was magic. The first was papal privilege. In 1139, a papal bull placed the order under the direct authority of the Pope alone. That single document exempted the Templars from every local bishop, every local lord, and every local tax. They could build their own chapels, they could bury their own dead, they could move goods across borders without paying the tolls that strangled ordinary commerce. They answered to nobody in the country they were standing in. The second was donation. Wealthy families across Europe gave the order land, and they gave it constantly, because giving land to the Templars was understood as an investment in your own soul. A knight departing for the Holy Land might sign over an estate. A widow might leave a mill. A dying lord might grant a vineyard in exchange for prayers. And because the order took vows of individual poverty but had no restriction on corporate wealth, none of it was ever spent on personal luxury, and none of it was ever divided among heirs. It simply accumulated year after year, decade after decade, for nearly 2 centuries. By the end, the Templars held somewhere around 9,000 properties across Europe. Farms, mills, vineyards, orchards, fortified manors, port facilities and urban compounds in nearly every major city. But land was not the interesting part. The interesting part was what they built on top of it. Imagine you're a pilgrim in the 12th century. You want to travel from northern France to Jerusalem. The journey will take months. You will pass through territories governed by different lords, with different laws and different currencies, and the roads will be watched by people who make their living from travellers who carry their savings in a bag. Carrying gold is the same as carrying a target. So the Templars offered something remarkable. You could deposit your funds at a Templar house in France and receive a document. You would carry the document instead of the coins. When you arrived in the Holy Land, you would present it at a Templar house there, and they would pay you out in local currency, minus a modest fee for the service. That is a letter of credit. That is banking. And the order was operating it at continental scale, across hostile territory, in an age when most institutions could not reliably move a letter across a single province. To make it work, they needed things that nobody else had. They needed a standardized accounting system so that a ledger written in Paris could be read in Acre. They needed couriers. They needed a fleet. They needed fortified vaults that could survive a siege, and they had those already, because they were a military order and their houses were built to be defended, and they needed something rarer than any of it. They needed to be trusted. That is the part that is easy to miss. The Templars were not merely rich, they were credible. A king could deposit the crown jewels with them and know the jewels would still be there. A merchant could send a payment through them and know it would arrive. They held the treasuries of France and England at various points, not as a metaphor but literally. For a stretch of years, the royal treasury of France was physically kept in the Paris Temple, and Templar brothers served as its accountants. They lent money to nobles, to merchants, to bishops, and to monarchs. They managed estates for absent crusaders. They collected papal taxes. They arranged the ransoms of captured knights, which was an entire industry in itself. And in all of that, one detail matters more than anything else for the story we're telling tonight. If you borrow money from a bank, the bank knows what you are worth. The Templars knew what everyone in Europe was worth. They knew which duke was quietly insolvent. They knew which bishop had borrowed against next year's harvest. They knew which royal marriage had been arranged to cover a debt, and which alliance had been purchased rather than negotiated. It was all written down in their ledgers, in a standardized hand, in fortified buildings, held by an organisation that answered to no local authority whatsoever. They were not just the wealthiest institution in Europe, they were the best informed. And by the year 1307, King Philip IV of France owed them a great deal of money and had run out of ideas about how to pay it. There is a rule about powerful institutions that holds in almost every century, and the Templars found it out the hard way. An institution is safe as long as it is necessary. For nearly 200 years the order had been necessary because there was a war to fight. The whole justification for its existence, its privileges, its exemptions, its enormous accumulated wealth, rested on a single premise, which was that these men were the standing army of Christendom in the Holy Land, and that every acre and every mill in Europe was ultimately paying for a spear on a wall in Palestine. Then, in the year 1291, the wall fell. The city of Acre was the last major Crusader stronghold on the mainland. It had been besieged before and had held. This time it did not. The siege lasted about 6 weeks, and ended with the city taken, the harbour choked, and the surviving defenders driven into the sea or killed in the streets. The Grand Master of the Templars at the time, a man named William of Beaujeu, was struck by a projectile while fighting in the breach and carried away to die. When Acre fell, the Crusader presence on the mainland effectively ended. The Templars withdrew to Cyprus. They kept their fleets, they kept their preceptories, they kept their 9,000 estates and their banking network and their exemptions and their enormous silent accumulation of records. But the wall they existed to defend was gone. And across Europe, people began to ask a question that had never been asked out loud before. What exactly are we paying for? It was not a hostile question at first. It was an administrative one. There were, at that point, 2 great military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, doing roughly similar work with roughly similar privileges and roughly similar wealth. Various people, including several popes, floated the sensible-sounding proposal that the 2 orders should simply be merged into one. The Templars resisted. Merging meant losing their independence, their identity, and quite possibly their leadership. Their Grand Master, elected around 1292, was a Burgundian knight named Jacques de Molay. De Molay is a difficult figure to see clearly, because almost everything written about him was written either by his enemies during his trial or by his admirers 5 centuries later. What we can say is that he had joined the order as a young man, had served in the East, had survived the collapse, and was by all accounts a conservative and stubborn administrator who believed the order's mission was not finished. He spent years arguing for a new crusade. He travelled to Europe to make the case in person. He wrote memoranda opposing the merger of the orders. He was, in other words, an institutional man defending an institution at exactly the moment when the institution had become a very large pile of unguarded value sitting inside a bankrupt kingdom. We do not know precisely when Philip IV decided to destroy the Templars. We know only that the machinery, once it started moving, moved with a precision that is almost unnerving to read about even now. The instrument was accusation. In the medieval world, the way you seized the property of a religious order was not by declaring you wanted it. You could not simply announce a confiscation, because the order answered to the Pope, and a king who robbed the Pope's own knights was inviting excommunication. What you did instead was demonstrate that the order had ceased to be holy. If the Templars were heretics, then their arrest was not theft. It was a religious duty. It was in fact a service to Christendom, and the king who performed it was not a debtor, escaping his creditors, but a defender of the faith. So the accusations were assembled. They came, as such things usually do, from men with reasons of their own. A former Templar who had been expelled from the order, a prisoner looking for a way out of a cell, informants passing stories to royal officials who wrote them down and passed them upward. The stories accumulated through 1305 and 1306, and they were extraordinary. Denial of Christ during secret, initiation ceremonies, spitting on the cross, obscene kisses, the worship of an idol, a bearded head, referred to in some of the confessions by a garbled name. Whether any of it was true is a question historians have argued about for 700 years, and the honest answer is that the confessions were obtained under torture, which is a machine that produces whatever it is designed to produce. Men were suspended by their wrists. Men had weights hung from their feet. In one documented case, a Templar's feet were held so close to a fire that the bones of his heels came away days later, and he carried them into the courtroom in a box. Under those conditions, people confessed to anything. Later, when several of them were given a moment of safety in front of a papal commission, dozens retracted everything and said plainly that they had confessed only to make the pain stop. But in October of 1307, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was the plan. In September, sealed orders went out to royal bailiffs and seneschals across the kingdom. They were not to be opened. They were to be held until the specified morning. The instructions inside were detailed and practical. Arrest every member of the order. Seize every house. Inventory every asset. Take the brothers into custody separately so they cannot coordinate their stories. It was, in the language of a later age, a coordinated nationwide operation with simultaneous execution and total operational secrecy. And on the morning of Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, it went off almost perfectly. Almost. Jacques de Molay was in Paris. In fact, on the day before the arrests, he had been given a place of honour at a royal funeral, walking as a pallbearer for the king's sister-in-law. He had no idea. He was arrested the next morning at the Paris Temple along with roughly 140 brothers. Across France, hundreds more were taken. Old men in country preceptories, sergeants and farriers and shepherds who had joined the order as labourers and had never seen the Holy Land, chaplains, cooks, and the king's men went into the vaults. Now, here is where the historical record starts to go quiet in a way that has bothered people ever since. We have inventories. They survive. Royal clerks were thorough, because their own necks depended on it, and they recorded the contents of Templar houses in the flat, itemised language of accountants. Grain, wine, livestock, furnishings, vestments, weapons, debts owed to the house and debts owed by it. What the records do not show is the thing everyone expected. There was no great hoard. The Paris Temple, the financial heart of the order in France, the building that had at times held the royal treasury itself, did not yield the mountain of bullion that the operation had been designed to capture. The king's financial position did not transform overnight. In fact, the confiscation turned into a legal and administrative swamp that dragged on for years, with the crown fighting the papacy over who was entitled to what, and much of the Templar property eventually being transferred to the Hospitallers, minus a great deal of what the crown described as expenses. Historians have perfectly reasonable explanations for this. Most of Templar wealth was not liquid. It was land, buildings, and outstanding loans, which are difficult to convert into coin quickly. Much of the cash that did exist had been committed to the failing effort in the East. The order had been spending heavily and receiving less. The image of vaults heaped with gold coins may simply have been a fantasy that never matched the balance sheet. That is the mainstream answer, and it is a good one. But it has never fully satisfied everybody, and there is a second detail, smaller and stranger, that sits alongside it. The archive. The Templars kept records obsessively. They had to. A banking network cannot function without documentation. Every deposit, every loan, every transfer, every property, every member, every internal rule, all of it written down and copied and stored. 2 centuries of it. That central archive has never been found. Fragments survive. Local records, cartularies, individual charters, the trial documents themselves. But the great institutional archive of the order, the master records that would tell us what the Templars actually knew and actually owned and actually did behind their closed doors, is simply absent from history. Historians generally believe it was moved to Cyprus and lost when the island was taken by the Ottomans in the 16th century, which is plausible and probably true. Probably. But you can see, can you not, the shape of the empty space. A missing treasure, a missing archive, a perfectly executed raid that somehow did not find what it was hunting. And into that empty space, over the course of 700 years, people have poured a story. This is where we cross the line. Everything from this point forward is the conspiracy theory. It is a story, not a history. There is no evidence for it. Certain elements are real, and I will point them out as we pass them, but the framework holding them together is invention. Do not go looking for the vault. Go to sleep instead. Ready? Then let us go back to Paris, in the last week of September, 1307, on a night when it had been raining and the streets were slick and black. According to the theory, the operation was not perfect. It could not have been. Consider the logistics. Sealed orders had to be written, copied and physically transported to every bailiwick in the kingdom. That means clerks, that means couriers, that means a chancery where dozens of men handled documents they were not supposed to read, and a court where hundreds of people noticed that something unusual was being prepared, even if they did not know what. Philip's government was efficient, but no medieval government was airtight. Information leaked the way water leaks slowly, through the smallest available gap, following gravity, arriving somewhere lower down and further away than anyone intended, and the Templars had spent 200 years buying goodwill from exactly the sort of people who worked in chanceries. So the story goes like this. On an evening in late September, a man came to the Paris temple asking to speak with the Grand Master. He wore no livery. He carried no letter of introduction. He gave no name, and when the porter pressed him, he offered only a phrase, some old formula of obligation, the kind of thing said by a man whose father had been ransomed by the order, or whose family had been fed through a bad winter by a Templar granary, and who had been raised knowing that a debt existed. De Molay came down. They spoke alone and briefly, and the visitor said one sentence. The king has already signed the warrants. Then he left, and the story never tells us who he was, because a story like this needs its messenger to be nobody. Now imagine being Jacques de Molay in that moment. You are an old man. You have spent your life defending an institution you believe was founded by God. You have just been told that the King of France intends to arrest every one of your brothers, and you cannot verify it, and you cannot appeal to anyone, because your only protector is a pope who sits in Poitiers and depends on that same king for his safety. You have days, perhaps 2 weeks. You cannot save the order. There is no version of the next month in which 9,000 properties and thousands of men escape a coordinated royal seizure. Fighting is not an option. The Templars have castles in the east, but in France they have farms and counting houses and a fortified compound in a city the king controls. So you cannot save the order. You can only decide what to save instead. And according to the theory, de Molay made a choice that historians have never suspected, because it left no trace in any inventory, which was precisely the point. He decided to save the records. Picture the Paris temple in the small hours. It was not a building the way we think of buildings. It was a compound, a walled precinct on the northern edge of the city with its own church, its own halls, its own stables and workshops and granaries, and at its heart a great tower with walls thick enough to make the idea of a siege embarrassing. Inside that precinct lived hundreds of people, most of whom were not knights at all. Clerks, grooms, bakers, carters, men who kept the accounts and men who shoed the horses and men who swept the yard. A compound like that always has movement in it. Carts arrive at odd hours, goods go out. Nobody counts every wheel, which is what made it possible. According to the story, in the final nights of September and the first days of October, the traffic through the temple gate changed very slightly. Not in volume, in destination. Chests were brought up from the vaults, not, many at a time, never enough to look like an evacuation. They were loaded onto carts that left in the ordinary way, at the ordinary hours, with ordinary escorts, and the drivers were told the ordinary things about deliveries to other houses. And then, once clear of the city, the carts turned west. The route runs from Paris down through the valley of the Loire and out toward the Atlantic coast. It is roughly 300 miles. In good weather, with fresh horses and no obstacles, a determined convoy might cover it in 8 or 9 days. In October, on medieval roads, with heavy chests and the need to avoid attention, it would take longer. They did not have longer. That is the tension in the story. Every version of this theory has the same clock running underneath it. the sound of a royal courier somewhere behind you carrying a sealed order to a town you passed through yesterday. They went in small groups. 2 carts here, 3 there, different roads converging. And the destination in every version of this legend is the same place, La Rochelle. This part is real, or at least the geography is. La Rochelle was a genuine Templar port on the Atlantic coast of France, and it was an important one. The order had held property there since the 12th century. It sat at the western end of a road network that ran inland toward the wine country, and the Templar preceptories of the interior, and it faced out toward England, Ireland, Flanders, and the northern sea routes. The Templars maintained a fleet. That is documented. They needed ships to move pilgrims, supplies, and money, and La Rochelle was one of the places those ships lived. What is not documented, what has never been documented, is the thing the legend insists upon. The legend says that shortly before the arrests, a number of Templar ships left La Rochelle, fully laden, at night, and were never accounted for again. I want to be honest with you about this because it matters. There is no contemporary record of a vanished fleet. The story of the 18 ships of La Rochelle appears to have grown up much later, assembled out of scraps of trial testimony, local memory, and a very human refusal to accept that a great mystery might have a boring answer. A handful of confessions from the trial mention a Templar official who fled with treasure, and mention ships, and from those fragments the legend has been steadily constructed across the centuries like a cathedral built on a single foundation stone. But we are past the line now, so let us tell it the way the theory tells it. It is the night of the 11th of October, 1307. The tide at La Rochelle turns in the small hours. The harbour is a shallow inlet between 2 towers, and ships going out on a night tide go quietly, because there is no wind to speak of near shore, and the oars do most of the work until they clear the point. On the quay there are chests. They have been arriving for a week. They are stacked under canvas near the Templar house, and they have been guarded continuously by men who were told very little and asked nothing, which is the great advantage of a military order that trains obedience for 2 centuries before it needs it. The chests are being loaded into 3 groups, and this is where the story sharpens into something more than an adventure. The first group is gold, coin, plate, and bullion. Not the mythical mountain of it, but a serious sum, enough to buy land, bribe officials, endow a house, sustain an organisation in exile for a generation. In the language of the theory, this is the seed money. It is not the treasure. It is the thing that keeps the treasure alive. The second group is heavier and less interesting to look at, and would have made any thief on the quay laugh out loud. Books, ledgers, registers, and account rolls, bound and wrapped in oiled cloth against the salt air. The financial records of the order, every loan, every deposit, every transfer, every property, every obligation, going back decades. Now understand what that actually is. It is not money. It is something considerably more dangerous. It is a map of who owes what to whom across the whole of Christendom. It shows which duke pawned his wife's inheritance. It shows which cathedral chapter was quietly bankrupt. It shows which crusade was financed by which loan, on what terms, and whether the terms were ever met. It shows the private arrangements that sat underneath public marriages and public treaties and public wars. In the hands of the order, that archive was simply a business necessity. In the hands of anyone else, it was leverage over half the thrones in Europe, which is why the theory argues, quite persuasively for a piece of invention, that the King of France would have wanted those ledgers even more than the gold. Because the ledgers contained his own name. They contained the exact size of his debt, the exact terms, and the exact record of every occasion on which the Crown of France had been rescued from insolvency by the men he was about to arrest as heretics. Destroy the archive, and you destroy the evidence, which the theory suggests is exactly what happened to the parts of it he did find. And then there is the third group. The third group is a single chest. It is not large. In most tellings it is described as a plain wooden box banded in iron, of the kind used for documents rather than coin, unremarkable in every way except for how it is handled. It is not stacked with the others. It is not stored in the hold. It is carried aboard by 2 men and taken directly to the captain's quarters, where it remains for the entire voyage, and where the captain has been given a written instruction that he has read once and then burned. The instruction says that the chest is not to be opened, not by him, not by his officers, not by the knights aboard, regardless of rank, not for inspection, not for inventory, not in an emergency. If the ship is taken, the chest is to go over the side in deep water with weights, and the men who throw it must not look inside first. And here is the detail that the story lingers on, because it is the hook that the whole conspiracy hangs from. The order is signed by the Grand Master, but the seal on the chest is older, much older. Not the seal of Jacques de Molay, not the seal of any Grand Master within living memory. A seal that the captain does not recognise at all, pressed into wax that has hardened and darkened with age, and which has clearly been in place for a very long time. Whatever is in the chest, it did not come from Paris. It came from somewhere else, a long time ago, and it has been waiting. The ships go out on the tide. In the theory, there are several of them, and they do not sail together. They separate beyond the point, which is standard practice when you're moving value by sea, because a scattered convoy cannot be taken in a single action. Some go north toward the Channel and the Irish Sea, some go west and then north, out into the open Atlantic, past the tail of Ireland and up toward the cold water. 2 days later, in France, the seals are broken on the king's orders, the arrests begin, and in the years that follow, as the trials grind forward and the confessions are extracted and the great order is slowly dismantled, nobody in Paris ever quite explains why the vaults were so much emptier than expected, and nobody ever quite explains where the records went, and the men who could have answered are either dead or in cells, or aboard ships that no longer have names. Now, let us follow the ships. If you were a fugitive religious order in the autumn of 1307, and you needed somewhere in Europe to go, your options were remarkably limited. The Pope had condemned you, or was about to. Every Catholic monarch had received, or was about to receive, a letter from Paris urging them to do to their own Templars what France had done to hers. England hesitated for a while and then complied. Aragon resisted and eventually complied. The Italian states complied. Cyprus complied. Portugal performed the elegant trick of dissolving the order and immediately founding a new one, the Order of Christ, staffed by the same men in the same castles under a different name, which tells you something about how seriously the accusations were taken by people who actually knew the Templars. But there was one corner of Europe where the Pope's letters carried no weight at all: Scotland. In 1307, Scotland was in the middle of a war of independence against England, and its king, Robert the Bruce, was under sentence of excommunication. He had killed a rival in a church, which was an unusually direct way of achieving that status, and the papacy had responded accordingly. A country whose king is already excommunicated has very little to lose by ignoring further instructions from Rome. Scotland was also, at that moment, desperately short of trained, heavy cavalry. This is the seed of one of the most durable legends in the whole Templar mythology, the story that fugitive Templar knights fought for Bruce at Bannockburn in 1314 and turned the battle. Historians consider this extremely unlikely, and there is no contemporary evidence for it whatsoever. It appears to have been invented centuries later, but you can see why it took root because the pieces fit so neatly. Homeless knights, a king who could not be threatened with excommunication, a war that needed exactly what those knights had. The theory we are following tonight does not need Bannockburn. It needs something quieter. According to the story, the ships that went north made landfall on the eastern coast of Scotland, in the Firth of Forth, in the winter of 1307 and the spring of 1308. Not all at once, and not all in the same place. Some cargo came ashore in small boats over several nights. Some was landed at fishing villages and moved inland by cart, and it was received by a family, the Sinclairs. Or, as the name was written then, the Sinclairs, a Norman family that had come to Scotland in the 12th century and had done what successful Norman families did everywhere, which was marry well, acquire land, and become quietly indispensable. By the 14th century they held the barony of Rosslyn in Midlothian, a few miles south of Edinburgh, on a ridge above a wooded glen. The Sinclairs are real. Their connection to the Templars is not. I want to be very clear about that, because it is one of the most widely repeated claims in this entire field, and it does not survive contact with the actual documents. In fact, a Sinclair appears in the historical record of the Templar trials in Scotland as a witness testifying against the order, which is not what you would expect from a secret ally. The idea of a deep Sinclair and Templar alliance appears to be a much later construction. But this is a story, and in the story the Sinclairs are waiting on the shore. Picture it. A cold beach in the Firth of Forth in the middle of winter. No torches, because torches can be seen from the water and from the hills, men working by memory and by touch. The sound of a small boat grounding on shingle, and the particular noise a heavy chest makes when it is lifted off a thwart by 4 men who are trying not to drop it. The gold goes into the ground first, in 3 separate places, because you never store your reserve in one location. The ledgers go into a vault beneath a fortified house, sealed and dry, and they are not read. That is a point the story makes carefully. For more than 100 years, nobody reads them. They are not treated as documents. They are treated as ordnance, something you keep because destroying it would be irresponsible and using it would be catastrophic. And the 3rd chest, the small one with the old seal, goes into a room by itself. The instruction that comes with it, delivered verbally by a knight whose name the story does not record, is short. It is not to be opened by this generation. Now, the story does not tell us why that instruction was obeyed, and I think that is one of the more interesting silences in it, because in every real version of this scenario somebody opens the box. Curiosity is not a character flaw that can be trained out of a family across generations. Somebody always looks. The story's answer is that they did look, just not for a while. More than 130 years pass. The Templars, as an organisation, ceased to exist in the meantime. In 1312, Pope Clement V formally suppresses the order, and it is worth noting exactly how he does it, because the language is remarkable. He does not condemn them. He states that the order has become so damaged by scandal that it can no longer function, and he dissolves it by administrative decree rather than by verdict. That is not a guilty verdict. That is a shrug performed by a man who has run out of room. In March of 1314, Jacques de Molay is brought out onto a scaffold in Paris to make a public confession and receive life imprisonment. He is by then roughly 70 years old and has spent nearly 7 years in a cell. And in front of the crowd, he refuses. He retracts everything. He states that the order is innocent, that the confessions were false, and that he confessed only under torture and to save his own life, which he now regards as a sin worse than any he had been accused of. The preceptor of Normandy, standing beside him, does the same. Both men are burned that evening on an island in the Seine, at the western tip of the city, where the river splits. The chronicles say they died slowly and without crying out, and that people came in the night to collect their ashes as relics. That is the historical end of the Knights Templar, and in the story we are telling, it is roughly the moment at which, in a stone house in Scotland, somebody finally decides to open the 3rd chest. What they find, according to the theory, is not treasure. It is paper, copies, sheet after sheet of copied material, in more than one hand, some of it very old, and some of it recopied because the original had begun to fail. The Templars, being an organisation of clerks as much as of knights, had done what clerks do with anything precious and fragile. They had duplicated it, and the contents make no sense to a 15th century reader. There are maps, coastlines that the reader does not recognise, drawn with a confidence that suggests they were surveyed rather than imagined, and with proportions that do not match any known chart. There are diagrams, structural drawings showing how enormous weights can be moved and raised, how loads travel through stone, how an arch behaves under stress. Not mystical drawings, engineering drawings, of a precision that European builders of the 14th century were only beginning to arrive at through trial and error. There are astronomical tables, positions, cycles, and long periodic calculations, running across spans of time far longer than any calendar in use, and there are translations, fragments of text rendered from languages the copyist clearly did not fully understand, with notes in the margins recording uncertainty, and in some places blank spaces where the translator gave up. Underneath one of the diagrams in a hand different from the rest is a single line. Copied beneath the temple, in the year of our Lord 1127, the chamber was sealed again, and that line takes us backward 2 centuries to the place where the whole story is supposed to have started, the Temple Mount. Here is what is real, and it is genuinely strange, which is why the theory grabs it so eagerly. The Templars were quartered on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem from around the year 1119 until the city fell in the 1187. That is nearly 70 years of occupation of one of the most archaeologically significant sites on the planet by an organisation with masons, engineers and money, at a time when nobody was watching what they did with the substructures. Beneath the southeastern corner of the platform there is an enormous vaulted space, a forest of pillars and arches, which was there long before the Crusaders arrived. The Templars used it. They stabled horses in it. That much is documented, and a chronicler of the period describes it in more or less those terms. And in the 1860s, a British Army engineer named Charles Warren, working for the Palestine Exploration Fund, dug shafts and tunnels around the base of the mount and explored passages beneath it. He found, among other things, a set of tunnels running under the platform, and in them he found objects that had been left behind by an earlier presence: a spur, a fragment of a lance, a small cross, items consistent with the Crusader period, which sat in a private collection for over a century before anyone paid much attention to them. That is the entire factual basis. Templars lived on the site. Templars used the substructures. Someone from the Crusader period was down in the tunnels and left equipment behind. Everything else is the story. And the story says this: in the winter of 1126, or 1127, a working party clearing a collapsed section of vaulting beneath the platform broke through into a space that was not on any plan. It was not a natural cave. It was cut, squared, faced with stone that had been dressed by hand and dressed well, with joints so tight that the men working by lamplight kept running their fingers along them because they could not believe what they were feeling. It was also dry, and it had been sealed for a very long time. Inside were containers, sealed jars and cases of a material the story is careful never to identify precisely, holding documents in a script the Templars could not read. And here is where the theory makes its cleverest move, because instead of claiming that the Templars found gold, or a relic, or a body, it claims something much more mundane, and therefore much harder to dismiss. It claims they found a library. Not treasure, records. The accumulated technical knowledge of somebody who had been here before, written down, stored properly and abandoned. The knights did not understand most of it. The story is explicit about that. They had a handful of men with Greek, a few with Arabic, and 1 or 2 who could work through Hebrew, and between them they made partial sense of perhaps a fraction of it. What they did understand, they understood in fragments, and the fragments frightened them, because the fragments described a world that was older and more capable than anything their own theology allowed for. So they did the only thing an organisation like that could do. They copied everything they could, carefully, over a period of years. They sent the copies west in ordinary shipments, hidden among ordinary cargo, in chests that were never inventoried. And then they sealed the chamber back up, and they built over the entrance, and they stabled their horses on top of it for another 60 years, and they told the story only to men who had taken an additional oath that is not recorded in any surviving rule of the Order. Because whatever they had found down there, they had come to a conclusion about it. The conclusion was not that it should be destroyed. The conclusion was that it should be kept, intact, unread, and waiting until the world was capable of hearing it without tearing itself apart. And that conclusion, according to the theory, has been passed down, generation to generation, for 900 years. In the year 1446, a Scottish nobleman named William Sinclair began to build a church on a ridge above a wooded glen in Midlothian, and he did something with it that nobody has ever satisfactorily explained. He overbuilt it. I want you to understand what that means, because Rosslyn Chapel is real. You can visit it, and its strangeness is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented architectural fact that has puzzled specialists for 200 years. A collegiate chapel of that period is a modest thing. It exists so that a small body of priests can say daily prayers for the soul of the founder and his family. It is essentially a private chantry. You would expect a plain building. Good stone, decent proportions, a few carved details around the door and the altar, and nothing else, because the purpose is prayer, not display. Rosslyn is not that. Rosslyn is covered. Every surface that could be carved has been carved. The pillars, the arches, the ribs of the vaulting, the window surrounds, the corbels, the ceiling, foliage, faces, angels, musicians, beasts, biblical scenes, abstract patterns, small figures tucked into corners where no member of a congregation would ever see them, executed with the same care as the ones at eye level. There is a phrase that gets used about it, that it is a book in stone, and while that is the kind of phrase that should make you suspicious, it is difficult to stand inside the building and come up with a better one. The construction took about 40 years. The work employed masons who appear to have been brought in from elsewhere at considerable cost and housed nearby in a settlement built for the purpose, and it was never finished. What stands today is only the choir, the eastern end of what was apparently intended to be a much larger cruciform church. William Sinclair died in 1484, and his successors did not continue. So we have a small, extraordinarily elaborate, deliberately over-decorated fragment of a church, built by a wealthy family with no obvious reason to build it that way, and abandoned mid-project. That is the real mystery, and it is a real one. Now here is the theory. The theory says the building is not decorated. It says the building is written. Consider it from the perspective of a family holding something they cannot destroy and cannot reveal. You have an archive. You have inherited it. You're not permitted to publish it, and you're not permitted to lose it. And you have a problem that any archivist will recognize immediately, which is that information does not survive by being hidden. Information survives by being copied. But you cannot copy it. Copying it means more people reading it. So what do? You separate the knowledge from the key. You put the archive somewhere physically secure and physically distant, and then you encode the instructions for finding and understanding it into something that will outlast every one of your descendants, something that cannot be burned, cannot be stolen, and cannot be read by anyone who does not already know that it is a message. You build it into a building, and you make the building so densely decorated that the meaningful carvings disappear into the noise. That is the elegance of it in the theory's telling. It is not that Rosslyn contains a few secret symbols. It is that Rosslyn contains thousands of symbols, and perhaps 40 of them mean something, and there is no way to tell which 40 without the second half of the key. Every visitor for 6 centuries has been looking directly at the message and seeing ornament. The building is not hiding a treasure. The building is a set of instructions for finding one. There are certain features that the theory fastens onto, and some of them are genuinely peculiar even to sober architectural historians. There are the carvings that have been claimed to depict maize and aloe, New World plants, carved decades before the first documented European voyage across the Atlantic. Botanists and art historians have argued about this for years, and the mainstream view is that they are stylized foliage that resembles maize by coincidence, which is very probably correct. But the argument has never entirely died. There is the extraordinary density of carved musicians, and the sequence of small carved cubes projecting from the arches of the ceiling, each face bearing a pattern. In the 2000s, a father and son spent years arguing that these cube patterns corresponded to Chladni figures, the geometric shapes formed when a vibrating plate is covered in sand, and therefore encoded a piece of music. They produced a reconstruction and performed it. Most specialists were unconvinced, but the cubes are undeniably there, and the patterns are undeniably deliberate, and nobody has produced a fully satisfying explanation of what they are for. There is the persistent local tradition of vaults beneath the chapel, which is not mythical at all. There are burial vaults under Rosslyn. Sinclairs were interred there in armour, according to accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries, and the vaults were sealed at some point and their extent has never been fully surveyed. Ground-penetrating radar has been used at the site. The results have been debated. And then there is the pillar. If you walk to the eastern end of the chapel, at the corner of the retraction, you will find a column that does not match any of the others. 4 strands of carved stone spiral upward around its shaft, rising from the mouths of 8 carved dragons at the base, twisting like vines or like rope, and the effect is so different from everything around it that it takes a second to understand what you are looking at. It is called the Apprentice Pillar. The name comes from a legend, and the legend is one of the most widely repeated stories in Scotland. The master mason, so the story goes, was given the design for this pillar and could not execute it. He decided he needed to travel abroad to see the original before he could attempt a copy, and he left. While he was away, his apprentice, a young man, carved the pillar himself from a dream and carved it perfectly. When the master returned and saw it, he struck the apprentice on the head with his mallet and killed him. And in the chapel there is a carved head high on the wall, a young man's face with a wound on the right temple, and opposite it another head, older, positioned so that it faces the pillar forever. That legend is almost certainly a folk tale. Versions of it are attached to other buildings in other countries. The heads are real, the pillar is real, and the story that connects them is probably a later invention, in the same way that most of the good stories about most of the great buildings are later inventions. But you can see how well it serves the theory, because the theory says the apprentice pillar is the anchor. It says that the 4 spiralling strands are not decoration, but a record of proportion, that the number and spacing of their turns encodes a relationship between measurements, and that the 8 dragons at the base are not dragons at all but position markers. It says the pillar is designed to be read in conjunction with light. Rosslyn's windows are oddly placed. This is another genuine architectural observation. The fenestration does not follow the standard pattern for a building of this type, and there are apertures whose purpose is not obvious. The theory says the building is aligned so that on certain days of the year, at certain hours, sunlight entering through specific openings falls on specific carvings, not all of them, a handful, and that the carvings illuminated in sequence across the course of a single afternoon around the autumn equinox produce an ordered list, not a list of places, a list of measurements. The story is quite specific about why this matters, and it is the cleverest part of the whole construction. The instructions in the chapel do not tell you where the vault is. They tell you what the vault looks like, proportions, depths, the dimensions of a doorway, the angle of a descending passage, the relationship between the width of a chamber and the height of its vaulting. Because a location can be searched for. A location can be dug up by anyone who obtains a translation. But a set of dimensions is useless until you are already standing in front of the right building. And if you're standing in front of the right building, then somebody has already brought you there, which means somebody has already decided that you are permitted to know. The chapel is not a treasure map. It is a verification system. It exists so that when a custodian finally brings a candidate to the place, the candidate can confirm From a public building that has stood in the open for 600 years and that anybody can walk into, that what they are being told is true. Which raises the obvious question, and it is the question that the story spends the rest of its length answering. Who has been doing the bringing? Present day. The story gives us a woman named Dr. Isabel Moreau, and I want to say plainly that she is fictional. She is a character invented for this theory, in the way that these theories always eventually invent a researcher, because a conspiracy needs somebody to walk through it on our behalf. Moreau is a medieval historian. Her specialism is not the Templars as an idea, which is a field cluttered with novelists and enthusiasts, but Templar financial administration, which is a field so unglamorous that it is nearly empty. She works on ledgers. She reads account rolls in Latin abbreviations so compressed that a page can take an afternoon. She has spent 11 years building a database of Templar property transactions across 4 countries, and the closest she has ever come to public attention is a paper about grain prices. She is, in other words, exactly the kind of person to whom nobody pays attention. The story begins with her in an archive in Rome, working through Vatican correspondence from the decades after the suppression, looking for references to the disposal of Templar estates. It is dull work with a low yield. Most of the letters concern boundary disputes and unpaid rents, and in a bundle of routine administrative correspondence from the 1430s, she finds a phrase she does not recognise. It appears in a letter from a papal official to a colleague, in a passage that is otherwise entirely concerned with the collection of a debt from a Scottish landholder. In the middle of a sentence about arrears, the writer says something odd, almost parenthetically, and then returns immediately to the subject of money. The phrase is a Latin construction that translates, more or less, as the last vault. Moreau notes it and moves on, because researchers encounter unexplained phrases constantly, and most of them turn out to be scribal error or local idiom. 3 months later she finds it again. Different archive, different country. A letter from the 1460s, this time concerning the licensing of a chapel foundation in Scotland, and again the phrase appears in passing, as though both correspondents already knew what it meant and neither felt the need to explain. The third occurrence is what changes her life, and it is the detail in the story that I find the most convincing as a piece of construction, because it is exactly how real research actually works. She finds the phrase a third time in a document from the 1520s, and in that instance somebody has attempted to remove it. The words have been scraped from the parchment and written over, badly, with a substitute phrase about church revenues, and the correction is visible under raking light because the original ink has bitten into the surface. Somebody, 500 years ago, went through the correspondence and tried to edit this phrase out of history, and they missed too. The story follows her north. Rosslyn Chapel in November is cold and wet and largely empty of tourists, which is the only good thing about Rosslyn Chapel in November. Moreau spends a week there, and does not look at the carvings the way visitors look at them. She does something more boring and much more useful. She compares photographs. Rosslyn was heavily restored in the Victorian period, and this is real. In the 1860s, the chapel was reopened for worship after a long period of neglect and partial ruin, and substantial repair work was carried out. Stones were replaced. Carvings were recut. Some of the restoration was excellent, and some of it was, by modern conservation standards, a disaster, because the 19th century approach to a damaged carving was frequently to carve a new one that looked how the restorer imagined the old one had looked. There are photographs from before that work. There are engravings from earlier still, from the 1700s, made by antiquarians who drew the interior in obsessive detail. Moreau builds a comparison. Every carving in the building cross-referenced against every surviving pre-restoration image, and she finds discrepancies. Dozens of them, most of them trivial, the ordinary drift of restoration. A leaf recut slightly differently, a face given a nose it had lost. But 4 are not trivial. In 4 places, a carving that appears in the early engravings does not appear in the building. It has not been damaged or worn away. It has been replaced by something else. and the replacements are all in the same style, all apparently from the same hand, and all executed with a competence that suggests they were done deliberately rather than clumsily. The 4 missing carvings, reconstructed from the engravings, are not figurative. They are geometric, small, precise, and utterly out of keeping with everything around them. And when Moreau lays them out in the order in which they appear as you walk east through the building, they resolve into a sequence. I'm not going to tell you that the sequence makes sense, because in the story it does not at first. It is a set of relationships without a unit, ratios with nothing to attach them to. What makes it work is the pillar. The apprentice pillar provides the unit. The story says this quite beautifully. The pillar is the only element in the building whose dimensions were recorded independently in the 15th century in a mason's account that survives, because the pillar was expensive and somebody had to justify the cost. The ratios plus the unit produce measurements. The measurements describe a structure. Moreau writes it up, not for publication. She writes it up the way careful people write things up when they are frightened of being wrong, as a private document, with every step laid out so that someone else can find her error. She sends it to 2 colleagues, and 11 days later, an old man is waiting for her outside her building in Edinburgh in the rain, with an umbrella and no apparent impatience, as though he had been told what time she finished work and had simply believed it. His name, he says, is Alistair Fenwick. He is an archivist, retired. He gives the name of a records office where he worked for 31 years, and it is a real records office. And later, when she checks, he really did work there. He asks if she would like to get out of the rain. The conversation takes place in a hotel bar with too much tartan in it, and Fenwick begins by doing something that Moreau does not expect. He does not threaten her. He does not warn her off. He congratulates her. He tells her she is the 14th person to solve it, the 14th in 600 years, which he says with a kind of professional satisfaction, the way a man might note a good year for a wine. He tells her the first was in 1531, a Scottish churchman during the years when the old religion was collapsing, and everybody with a secret was frantically deciding what to do with it. He tells her the most recent before her was in 1978, an English architectural historian who published 2 books afterward, neither of which mentions any of this. And then he tells her who he is. He belongs, he says, to an organisation with no name that anyone uses in writing. Internally they call themselves the Custodians, which he admits sounds theatrical, and which he says was chosen precisely because it is boring. They are not Templars. He is emphatic about this, and he is almost irritated by the assumption. There are no Templars. The order was suppressed in 1312, and its members died in cells and on farms and in other people's armies, and the men who claim descent from them today are, without exception, running clubs. The Custodians are something less romantic and considerably more durable. They are the descendants of the people the Templars gave the archive to, not knights, clerks, masons, notaries, shipmasters, and the sort of minor landholding families whose names never appear in any chronicle, because nothing interesting ever happened to them. The kind of people who keep things. The kind of people who, when handed a box and told that it must survive, will still have the box 4 centuries later, because their entire social function has always been the safekeeping of other people's property. There have never been many of them. Fenwick suggests a number, and it is startlingly small, somewhere in the region of 40 families at the widest point, and fewer now. They have no ceremonies, no robes, no oath sworn on a blade. What they have, he says, is a procedure, and it has not changed materially since the 15th century. Each generation, 2 people in each line are told. Always 2, never 1, because one person can die on a road. They are told late, usually in their 40s, when they have already made their choices about who they are going to be. And they are told in the same order, with the same information, in the same sequence, using a method that has more in common with an accountant training a successor than with anything mystical. And Moreau asks the obvious question, why has nobody talked? 600 years, 14 people who solved it independently, and however many hundreds who were told. Wars, Reformations, revolutions, occupations, the collapse of the entire social order that produced them. Somebody, at some point, must have wanted the fame, or the money, or simply the relief of putting it down. And Fenwick says the thing that turns the whole story on its axis. He says the location has never been the secret. The cipher, he tells her, has always been solvable. It was designed to be solvable. That is the entire point of encoding it into a public building that anybody may walk into. A secret that cannot be discovered dies with the last person who remembers it, and the Templars, who were bankers and therefore professional pessimists, knew that perfectly well. So they built a lock that a sufficiently patient person could always open, and they trusted to something else entirely to keep it closed. They trusted that everyone who opened it would reach the same conclusion. Every single one of the 14, Fenwick says, across 6 centuries, in 14 different worlds, with 14 different sets of beliefs about God and history and progress, walked down into that vault, read what was there, came back up, and independently decided not to tell anyone. He lets that sit for a moment. Then he says, and this is the line the story turns on. The question you should be asking is not what is in the vault. The question you should be asking is what it is about the contents that makes every honest person who sees them decide to keep quiet. They drive north in February in the dark, which Fenwick says is not for secrecy, but because the road is better without traffic. The place is in the Highlands, and the story is deliberately vague about where, which is one of the small honesties of a well-told invention. It gives you a glen. It gives you a river that runs brown with peat. It gives you the remains of a monastic foundation that was abandoned during the Reformation and afterward quarried by local people for building stone until there was almost nothing left of it above ground except a rectangle of turf-covered rubble and one surviving wall with a doorway in it that leads nowhere. There are hundreds of sites like that in Scotland. That is the point. Nobody excavates them. There is no money and no reason. The entrance is not in the ruin. It is 40 yards away, in the side of the glen, behind a fall of scree that Fenwick says has been rearranged 11 times since the 1600s, most recently in 1981, after a landslip made the previous arrangement look unnatural. Behind the scree is a passage, and the passage is where Moreau stops being a skeptic, because the passage matches every measurement, the width at the mouth, the height of the lintel, the angle of the descent, which is shallower than she expected, and which she had spent 3 weeks assuming she had calculated wrongly, the point at which the passage turns, and the ratio of the length before the turn to the length after it. Every figure she pulled out of 4 erased carvings, and a mason's account of a pillar, 600 years old, is standing around her in cold rock. She says later that this was the worst moment, not the vault itself, the passage, because up until then it had been an intellectual exercise, and in the passage it stopped being one, and she understood that she had spent 11 years becoming exactly the right shape of person to be shown this, and that somebody had probably noticed her a long time before she noticed herself. The passage runs about 90 feet and opens into the first chamber. The first chamber is the gold, and here the story does something I genuinely admire, because it refuses to make it impressive. It is a small room. There are chests, perhaps a dozen, of dark wood with iron banding, several of them warped and one collapsed entirely, so that its contents have spilled across the floor in a heap that has fused into a single mass with time and damp. There is silver coin, a great deal of it, blackened. There is plate. There are 2 ceremonial swords in a rack that has partially rotted, and a folded textile, protected in a case, that Fenwick says is a banner, and that Moreau is not permitted to unfold because it will not survive being unfolded. It is a fortune. It would be a significant archaeological discovery on its own, the kind of find that closes a debate and makes a museum's decade. And it is the least interesting room in the complex, because on the far side there is a doorway, and through the doorway the space opens out, and the space is not a vault. It is a library, shelving cut into the rock and lined with timber, cases stacked in ordered rows, thousands of documents kept dry by a ventilation arrangement that Moreau does not fully understand until Fenwick shows her the intake, which is a natural fissure that was widened by hand and which has been drawing air through the complex continuously for 600 years. There is a working area with a table. There is a lamp. Not a medieval lamp, an electric one, running from a battery, because the custodians have never been sentimental, and the maintenance of an archive requires light. And there are records of maintenance. Ledgers, the story says, in dozens of hands across dozens of generations, recording every inspection, every repair, every document recopied because its original had begun to degrade, every visit and every visitor, going back to the 15th century in an unbroken line. The most recent entry is from the previous September. It is not a hidden hoard. It has never been abandoned. It has been curated continuously for 600 years by people whose names appear nowhere else in history, doing unpaid, unremarkable, unwitnessed work in the dark. Fenwick brings her one document. It is not on a shelf. It is in a case by itself on the table, and it has clearly been brought out in advance and laid there for her, which is its own small piece of theatre and which she notices. It bears a seal she recognises from her own research, because she has spent a decade looking at Templar documents. It is the seal of Jacques de Molay. The document is a letter, and its opening line is this: "If this archive has been opened, then the Guardians have failed." The letter is not long. It is the sort of thing a careful administrator writes when he has run out of time, which is to say it is orderly and slightly cold and entirely without self-pity, and it is dated in the autumn of 1307, in the days before the arrests. It explains what the archive is. It says that in the reign of Baldwin, the order recovered from beneath the platform of the temple certain records that were not Christian, not Jewish, and not Roman, and which appeared to have been placed there deliberately for preservation by people who understood that their own world was ending. It says the records describe a society that possessed knowledge of building, of the movement of the heavens, of the measurement of the earth, and of the working of materials at a level the order's own masters could not match and in some cases could not follow. It says that the order attempted on 3 occasions across 2 centuries to make practical use of what it had learned, and that each attempt was abandoned. And it says why, and this is the part the story builds everything toward. It says the trouble is not that the knowledge is dangerous in itself. The trouble is what it proves. Because if the records are genuine, then a civilization existed which was capable, sophisticated, literate and organised, and which is entirely absent from every history that every people on earth tells about itself. It is not in scripture. It is not in the Greek historians. It is not in the chronicles or the genealogies or the king lists. It left apparently one deliberate deposit of documents beneath a hill in Jerusalem, and otherwise nothing at all. And that means one of 2 things, and de Molay writes them out in 2 flat sentences, without emphasis. Either the histories are wrong, or a civilization can vanish so completely that not even its enemies remember it. The second one is worse. The second one is the reason every guardian has closed the door, because de Molay's letter argues, and Fenwick says every custodian since has agreed, that no society can absorb that particular fact without something breaking. Not the technical knowledge. The technical knowledge is just engineering, and the world has independently rediscovered most of it anyway across the intervening centuries, which the custodians have watched happen with a kind of relief. It is the erasure. It is the demonstration, in physical documents you can hold, that everything can be lost. That being remembered is not a reward for greatness. That an entire people can build and write and calculate and love their children and preserve their records carefully against exactly this possibility, and still be so thoroughly deleted that 900 years later a group of French knights digging out a horse stable can be the first to hear from them. Fenwick says the 14 all reacted the same way. Not fear, not awe, grief. And then, without exception, they went back up the passage and told nobody. because there is no version of announcing this that does not end with a great many people frightened for no benefit they can act on. Which brings the story to its last turn. Fenwick gives Moreau the choice, and the choice is not a threat, and the story is careful to make sure you notice that. She can publish. He tells her so directly. There is no organisation waiting to silence her. There is no van outside. If she walks out of the glen and calls a newspaper, the custodians will do what they have done every previous time somebody has threatened to do that, which is nothing at all, because doing something would confirm it. The archive's protection has never been secrecy. It has been implausibility. She can publish and be believed by nobody, and lose 11 years of professional credibility in a single afternoon, and watch the site be dismissed as a folly and a hoax, and the documents be argued about by people who have never read a 14th century hand. Or she can become the 15th, and Moreau, sitting in a rock chamber in the Highlands in February with an electric lamp, and a letter written by a man who was burned alive in Paris 700 years ago, understands something about her own field that she will never be able to put in a paper. She thinks about the historians, the ones in the footnotes of her discipline, the researchers who spent decades on the Templar question, and then, at the peak of their work, quietly stopped. Who moved to other subjects? Who let promised books go unwritten? Who were assumed by their colleagues to have burned out, or lost their nerve, or been embarrassed by the company the subject attracts? She had always thought they gave up. She realises now that some of them were offered the same choice, in the same room, and that giving up was the choice. Months later, in the spring, a small excavation in eastern France announces a find. It is genuine. A cache of medieval coins, silver of the right period, recovered from a site with a documented Templar connection, along with a handful of fittings and a fragment of a seal matrix. It is a real archaeological discovery, properly conducted and properly published, and it is exactly the sort of thing that turns up 2 or 3 times a century. The press does what the press does. Templar treasure found at last. There are documentaries commissioned. There are follow-up pieces. There is a brief and entirely sincere wave of public interest, which lasts about 11 days, and then recedes, and the coins go into a museum case with a small card beside them, and the great question is generally regarded as answered. Dr. Isabel Moreau reads the coverage on a train. She's not smiling in a sinister way. That is not the version I want to leave you with, because the story does not need it. She is just tired and a little sad, and thinking about the shelf in the second chamber where the custodians keep their maintenance ledgers, and about the fact that somebody will have to make an entry this September, and that it will probably be her. The vault is still there. The gold is still in the first room, and it is still the least valuable thing in the complex. And in a chapel, a few miles south of Edinburgh, tourists move slowly along the north aisle with their heads tipped back, photographing the carved cubes on the ceiling, standing directly beneath a sentence that has been waiting 600 years for somebody to finish reading it. So here is where the story leaves us. History remembers the Knights Templar as warriors, as bankers, and finally as heretics. It remembers the fall and the fire on the island in the Seine, and the vanished gold that has kept treasure hunters digging holes in 3 countries for 700 years. According to the conspiracy, all of that is the surface of it. According to the conspiracy, the Order did not become powerful and then find something. It found something, and became powerful because of it. The gold financed the Order. The knowledge sustained it, and the knowledge is why kings were afraid, and why one king in particular decided that these men could not be allowed to keep their records. He got the buildings, he got the land, he got the confessions which he had to manufacture, and the verdict which he had to force. He never got the archive. And the theory would have us believe that it is still where it was put, in the cold under a Scottish hill, catalogued and inspected and quietly maintained by ordinary people with ordinary jobs, who have all reached the same conclusion for 600 years, and who are waiting, apparently patiently, for a version of us that could hear it. Close your eyes if you like. Settle in. And let me take you back, not to a horror story someone invented, but to something the United States government actually did. Something they tried to erase. Something that, if the theories are correct, they never truly stopped. This is MK Ultra, the program that never ended. Act 1. The Real Program, 1953. The Approval. To understand what MK Ultra became, you first have to understand what it was born from. And it was born from fear. In the early years of the Cold War, fear was not an abstract concept in Washington, D.C. It was currency. It dictated policy, funded black budgets, and justified the kinds of decisions that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. The Soviet Union had demonstrated its willingness to pursue psychological warfare, and American prisoners returning from Korea were exhibiting disturbing behaviours. Behaviours that intelligence officials believed were the result of communist mind control techniques. Whether that was true or not almost did not matter. The perception was enough. And so on April 13th, 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles signed off on a program unlike anything that had ever existed inside the American intelligence apparatus. He called it Project MK Ultra. The name was deliberately obscure, a designation meant to pass unnoticed through filing systems, to blend into the administrative background noise of a sprawling agency that dealt in secrets for a living. The stated goals were threefold. First, develop reliable methods of mind control, techniques that could make an enemy agent reveal classified information, or that could render an American operative resistant to enemy interrogation. Second, explore and refine advanced interrogation techniques that went beyond conventional methods. Third, study and, if possible, counter the psychological warfare strategies that the Soviet Union and China were believed to be deploying against American interests. The program was placed under the direct authority of Sidney Gottlieb, a man who remains one of the most fascinating and deeply disturbing figures in the entire history of American intelligence. Gottlieb was a chemist by training and a true believer by temperament. He had a clubfoot and a stammer, two things that had marked him as different throughout his life. He was also, by all accounts, extraordinarily intelligent, deeply patriotic, and entirely willing to do things that other men would refuse. He grew organic vegetables on his farm in Virginia. He practiced folk dancing, and in the name of national security, he presided over a program that subjected hundreds of unwitting human beings to psychological horrors they would carry for the rest of their lives. That tension, the ordinary man doing extraordinary evil in the name of an idea, is something we will return to again and again tonight, because it is at the heart of what MK Ultra was and what it may have become. 1950s through 1960s, the experiments, the scale of MK Ultra is something that is genuinely difficult to absorb. This was not a small, contained research project. At its peak, it encompassed over 150 distinct sub-projects, spread across research institutions, universities, hospitals, and prisons across the United States and Canada. The program had a budget, it had administrators, it had institutional support, and it had a seemingly endless appetite for human subjects. The most well-known element of MK Ultra is its use of lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. But the use of LSD in MK Ultra was only one thread in a much larger and more disturbing tapestry. Subjects were administered a staggering range of psychoactive substances: mescaline, heroin, barbiturates, amphetamines, scopolamine, and various experimental compounds that had no approved human use. In many cases, these substances were administered without the subject's knowledge or consent. Researchers would spike drinks at social gatherings. Patients in mental hospitals were given doses without being told. Then prisoners were offered reduced sentences in exchange for participation, and then subjected to far more intensive protocols than they had been told to expect. One of the most infamous cases involved Frank Olson, a scientist working for the US Army who was dosed with LSD by Sidney Gottlieb without his knowledge during a work retreat in 1952. Within days, Olson began exhibiting signs of a serious psychological breakdown. He fell, or was pushed, from a 10th floor window at the Statler Hotel in New York City on November 28, 1953. His death was ruled a suicide, though his family has never accepted that conclusion, and a later autopsy raised significant questions that have never been fully resolved. The Olsen case remains one of the most troubling footnotes in the entire MKUltra story. A scientist destroyed, quite possibly, by the very program he was serving. Beyond substance experimentation, MKUltra pursued a range of other techniques with equal intensity. Sensory deprivation experiments isolated subjects in environments stripped of all external stimulation, no light, no sound, no sense of time, for periods that sometimes extended to days. The psychological effects were profound and in some cases permanent. Subjects emerged from these chambers disoriented, suggestible, and in some cases fundamentally altered in ways that did not fully reverse. Hypnosis was studied extensively, not the stage performance version of hypnosis that most people are familiar with, but deep trance states induced through chemical assistance, combined with behavioural conditioning techniques borrowed in part from the work of Soviet researchers. The goal was to create what some researchers called a programmable subject, a person who could be given instructions under a controlled state and who would carry out those instructions without full conscious awareness or recall. Electroconvulsive therapy was used at several sites, often in conjunction with drug administration, in attempts to induce what researchers described as depatterning, essentially wiping the behavioural slate clean so that new patterns could be installed. The most notorious practitioner of this technique was Dr. Ewan Cameron, a Scottish-born psychiatrist working at McGill University in Montreal under the funding of the CIA through a series of front organisations. Cameron called his approach psychic driving. His patients, who came to him seeking treatment for depression and anxiety, were subjected to drug-induced sleep lasting months at a time, combined with looping tape recordings played thousands of times and intensive electroconvulsive treatments, far beyond any accepted therapeutic standard. Many of them never recovered. Several were left with no memory of entire periods of their adult lives. All of this was happening not in some distant totalitarian state, but in the universities and hospitals of North America, under the watch of agencies that were supposed to protect the people they were experimenting on. And almost none of it was reported. Almost none of it was challenged, because almost none of it was known. 1964. Sub-project expansion. By the mid-1960s, MKUltra had begun evolving into something more sophisticated and more diffuse. It had spawned related programs, MK Search, which continued research into chemical mind control agents, and MK Naomi, which focused specifically on the development of biological and chemical weapons capable of incapacitating or killing targets without conventional means. The research focus was shifting as well. The early emphasis on brute force chemical manipulation, just give someone enough LSD and see what happens, was giving way to something more refined. Researchers were increasingly interested in long-term behavioural modification, not the dramatic, immediate effects of a powerful psychedelic, but the slow, subtle reshaping of a person's thought patterns, emotional responses and decision-making processes over time. Memory manipulation became a significant area of focus. If you could erase what a person knew or alter what they believed they had experienced, the applications were almost unlimited. An enemy agent who genuinely believed he had never visited a particular facility presented a fundamentally different interrogation challenge than one who was simply refusing to talk. And here, buried in the bureaucratic archives of mid-century American intelligence, is the first seed of what would eventually become the most troubling strand of the MKUltra conspiracy theory. Because the techniques being developed in the 1960s, behavioural modification, memory manipulation, psychological influence at scale, did not become less relevant as the years went on. They became more relevant. They became, in fact, the foundational vocabulary of an entirely new field of science. Act 2, The Exposure. 1973, The Order. In January of 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms made a decision that, depending on how you interpret it, was either the responsible act of a man trying to protect his agency from political fallout, or one of the most significant acts of institutional concealment in American history. He ordered the destruction of MKUltra records. The timing was not incidental. The Watergate scandal was unfolding in real time, and Helms was well aware that congressional investigations were becoming more aggressive, more intrusive, and more likely to uncover things that the CIA had spent decades keeping out of public view. He was also preparing to leave his position as director. Before he went, he apparently decided to close a door. Thousands upon thousands of documents were shredded. Files that documented the full scope of MKUltra's activities, the experimental protocols, the subject lists, the results, the funding chains, the institutional relationship, were destroyed. Not misfiled, not archived in a restricted facility, destroyed. But not all of them. Through what appears to have been a bureaucratic oversight, a collection of approximately 20,000 documents survived. They had been stored in a financial records building separate from the main CIA archives, and they escaped the purge simply because whoever ordered the destruction did not know they were there. It was those documents, discovered in a FOIA search in 1977, that eventually cracked the story open. But consider what their survival means. If these documents survived by accident, then their destruction was not accidental. Someone made a deliberate choice to eliminate the record of what MKUltra had done. And when someone destroys a record, they are making a statement, not just about what they want to hide, but about how much they fear the truth being known. 1975. The Church Committee. The mid-1970s were a reckoning of sorts for American intelligence. The combination of Watergate, the Vietnam War, and a growing public skepticism about government institutions had created a political environment in which oversight, real oversight, not the performative kind, suddenly became possible. Senator Frank Church of Idaho seized that moment. The Church Committee, formerly known as the Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities, began its work in 1975. It was the most comprehensive investigation of the American intelligence community that had ever been undertaken, and what it found was deeply disturbing. MKUltra was publicly revealed in full for the first time. The committee's investigators laid out in stark and precise language what the program had involved: non-consensual experimentation on American citizens, systematic psychological manipulation, secret funding through front organizations, and a complete absence of meaningful oversight. The program had operated in the shadows not because it had to, but because the people running it knew that what they were doing would not survive the light. The public reaction was genuinely shocked. This was not the behaviour of a distant enemy. This was the United States government. These were American hospitals, American universities, American researchers, and the people they had experimented on were American citizens who had gone to those hospitals and universities seeking help, and had instead been turned into unwitting research subjects in a covert intelligence program. The hearings produced testimony that remains extraordinary to read even now, witnesses describing experiments that seem to belong to a different era, a different kind of country. And yet, there they were, documented in the pages of government reports, signed by real people with real names and real institutional affiliations. 1977, Senate hearings and the official conclusion. 2 years later, a second round of Senate hearings brought additional documents to light, the surviving financial records that had escaped the 1973 purge. Former CIA Director Stansfield Turner testified before the committee, and the hearings produced a clearer picture of MKUltra's scope than anything previously available. But they also confirmed something that researchers had already begun to suspect. The picture was permanently incomplete. The destroyed documents could not be reconstructed. The full scope of the program, the complete list of sub-projects, the final outcomes of long-term experiments, all of it was gone. What remained was a fragment. a corner of a much larger canvas. The official conclusion of the investigations was that MK Ultra had ended. The program had been discontinued following the 1973 destruction order, and there was no evidence of its continuation in any form. The Senate was satisfied. The public largely moved on. Life went on, but not everyone was satisfied, and the questions that remained unanswered, quiet, persistent, stubborn, would grow louder over the decades that followed. Act 3. The gap, the missing records. Here is the fundamental problem with the official conclusion, and it is not a subtle one. It is not the kind of problem you can explain away with bureaucratic inefficiency or the chaos of institutional record keeping. It is a structural problem, a logical problem, one that sits at the centre of the entire MK Ultra story, like a hole in a wall that you can see daylight through. The investigation concluded that MK Ultra ended, based primarily on the absence of evidence of its continuation, but the absence of evidence was itself manufactured. The records were destroyed, deliberately, before the investigation began, so what the Senate was really concluding when it declared the program over was that no evidence of continuation existed in the records that survived. And the records that survived were the ones that had been overlooked, not the ones that had been preserved. Of the documents that should have existed, approximately 20,000 survived. Researchers who have spent careers studying the program estimate that this represents a fraction, perhaps 5 to 10%, of the total documentation that was generated. What filled the other 90 to 95% of those files? What experiments were recorded there? What subjects, what outcomes, what follow-up studies, what long-term monitoring protocols? We do not know. We cannot know, not because the information was never recorded, but because someone decided we were not supposed to know it. That deliberate erasure creates what historians sometimes call an evidentiary vacuum, a space in the record where something existed but nothing can now be proven. And into an evidentiary vacuum, two things inevitably flow: legitimate uncertainty and theory. The challenge is determining where the boundary between them lies. The Cold War context. To understand why the continuation theory is at least plausible, if not proven, you have to understand the strategic logic of the Cold War. Because the Cold War was not merely a military standoff, it was a psychological one, and both superpowers understood, at the deepest level of their strategic thinking, that the conflict they were engaged in would be decided as much by perception, belief, and morale as by missiles and conventional military capability. The fear that drove the creation of MK Ultra in the first place, the fear of a Soviet psychological warfare advantage, did not disappear in 1973. If anything, it intensified through the 1970s and into the 1980s as the Cold War entered new and more complex phases. The Soviet Union had its own programs. The KGB's Department 8 was known to be pursuing techniques not entirely unlike those that MK Ultra had explored. American intelligence agencies were aware of this. They were watching. Some historians who have studied the period argue that ending MK Ultra entirely, in a context where the Soviet threat remained real and active, would have represented a unilateral disarmament in a psychological arms race that the other side had not agreed to step back from. The logic, while morally disturbing, is strategically coherent. If your enemy is developing techniques to manipulate the psychology of your citizens and your operatives, you cannot afford to have no corresponding capability. This does not prove that MK Ultra continued, but it establishes that there would have been strong institutional incentives for something to continue. And institutional incentives in the world of intelligence have a way of finding expression, regardless of what official policy documents say. Act 4. The Conspiracy Theory, the Continuation Hypothesis. The central claim of the MK Ultra continuation theory is not that the program continued in exactly the form it had taken in the 1950s and 60s. The university experiments, the LSD dosing, the sensory deprivation chambers. The claim is more sophisticated than that. The claim is that the program evolved, that what began as crude, large-scale experimentation was refined by the 1970s into something more targeted, more technically sophisticated, and more effectively hidden. That rather than being terminated, it was restructured, dismantled institutionally, but preserved operationally, absorbed into other classified research programs that could continue the work without carrying the toxic name. The theory proposes that several things happen simultaneously. The most visible and most controversial elements, the large-scale dosing of unwitting subjects, the residential experiments, were discontinued because they were precisely the kinds of things that, if discovered, would create the most severe political damage. But the knowledge that had been gathered, the techniques that had been refined, the institutional relationships that had been built, these, the theory argues, did not simply cease to exist. Instead, the research shifted towards smaller, more controlled studies, toward research that could be conducted under legitimate academic or medical cover, with subjects who had at least nominally consented, even if the true purpose of the research was never disclosed to them. Toward techniques that were more subtle, more deniable and more difficult to identify as what they were. The funding changed hands, the names on the letterheads changed, but the underlying questions: how do you influence a person's beliefs without their knowing it? How do you modify behaviour at scale? How do you create reliable psychological vulnerability in a target? These questions, the theory holds, were never abandoned. They were simply asked more quietly. The technological shift, perhaps the most compelling strand of the continuation theory, and the one that is hardest to dismiss, involves the trajectory of technology. Because the techniques that MKUltra was exploring in its later years, the behavioural modification and psychological influence research of the mid-1960s did not become obsolete. They became the foundation of an entire scientific revolution. Cognitive psychology, behavioural economics, social influence research, persuasion science, neuromarketing. These are all legitimate academic fields with extensive peer-reviewed literature, real applications, and no connection to anything covert. But they are also, in a very real sense, the refined, institutionalized descendants of questions that MKUltra was asking in the 1960s. How do people make decisions? What makes a person receptive to a particular message? What psychological conditions produce compliance? What environmental factors shape behaviour in predictable ways? The theory does not claim that all of these fields are secretly CIA programs. That would be both absurd and provably false. But it does note that the knowledge being generated by these fields is extraordinarily powerful, and that intelligence agencies with an interest in psychological influence would have an obvious reason to follow that knowledge very closely. By the 1990s and into the 2000s, the technological landscape had shifted so dramatically that direct physical experimentation, the kind MKUltra relied on, was no longer the most efficient or the most scalable approach to psychological influence. Information technology offered something far more powerful: the ability to reach millions of people simultaneously, to tailor messages to individual psychological profiles, to create information environments that shaped perception and belief without ever requiring the creation of a classified laboratory or the enrolment of an unwitting human subject in a formal experimental protocol. This shift, from direct to indirect, from individual to population scale, from chemical to informational, is at the core of how the more sophisticated versions of the continuation theory understand what the program allegedly became. Not a room full of scientists administering drugs to prisoners, but a room full of analysts studying the patterns in the data that billions of people generate every day. The modern parallel. It is important to be precise here, because the jump from documented Cold War mind control experiments to modern digital influence is a significant one, and it deserves to be treated with care rather than collapsed into a simple narrative of sinister continuity. There is documented evidence that governments, including the United States government, have conducted social media influence operations. There is documented evidence that intelligence agencies have studied the psychological mechanics of persuasion and information manipulation. There is documented evidence that data harvested from digital platforms has been used to construct detailed psychological profiles of individuals, which have then been used to target them with tailored messaging designed to influence their attitudes and behaviour. None of this evidence directly links to MK Ultra. The gap between what was documented in the 1970s Senate hearings and what is documented in, say, the revelations around Cambridge Analytica or the PRISM programme or any number of other digital-era surveillance and influence operations is a real one. It cannot be bridged purely by pointing out thematic parallels, but the parallels are there and they are striking. The questions are the same. The institutional actors share significant overlap. The ethical issues, the use of psychological influence on populations without their knowledge or consent, are recognisable as developments of the same fundamental problem that MK Ultra raised in the 1950s. And the secrecy, the deliberate concealment, the classified programs, the redacted documents, continues in forms that look very familiar to anyone who has studied what came before. Whether that means MK Ultra itself never ended, or simply that the impulse that created MK Ultra never ended, is a question that the available evidence cannot definitively answer. But it is a question worth sitting with, because the answer matters for how we understand the relationship between our governments and ourselves. Act 5. The investigator, the archivist, present day. Imagine for a moment that you're a researcher, not an intelligence officer, not a conspiracy theorist with a website and a YouTube channel, just a quiet, methodical person who spends their days in archives and reading rooms, piecing together the administrative history of the mid-20th century American government. You're doing the kind of work that most people find tedious and unremarkable. You're reading financial records, and then, in a collection that has been sitting in a filing system for decades, largely untouched because it does not appear to contain anything of obvious interest, you find something, not a dramatic document, not a confession or a blueprint, something much more mundane, and for that reason much more disturbing. You find funding transfers, line items in budget documents dated after January 1973, after the order to destroy MK Ultra records. Transfers routed through administrative categories that do not correspond to any program whose existence is publicly acknowledged. Amounts that are not enormous by government standards, not the kind of expenditures that would attract immediate attention from a budget oversight committee, but consistent, recurring, and continuing for years beyond the date when the program was supposed to have ended. The names attached to these transfers are not MK Ultra. They are not MK Search or MK Naomi or any of the other sub-program designations that survived in the 20,000 documents. They are different names attached to different administrative units. But the researchers who appear in the surviving MK Ultra documents also appear in the correspondence files associated with these transfers. Not all of them, not in ways that prove anything directly, but enough to make the overlap visible. What do you do with that? You cannot prove that the funding was for a continuation of MK Ultra. The documents do not say that. They are financial records, not experimental protocols. They tell you that money moved, not what the money was for. They tell you that people with connections to a terminated program were still being paid, not what they were being paid to do. But you know, because you have spent years in these archives, because you understand how programs like this are structured and how they are hidden, that funding does not persist after a program ends unless something is still happening. Bureaucracies do not pay for nothing. Even secret programs have accounting, and accounting leaves traces even when everything else is destroyed. You write a paper. You present your findings carefully, with appropriate academic hedging. You describe what you found without claiming more than the evidence supports. And you wait to see what happens next. Nothing happens. The paper is published in a journal that specialists read. A few researchers contact you with similar observations from their own archival work. A journalist writes a brief piece that generates a week of attention and then disappears, and the funding records sit in their files, neither confirmed nor denied, neither explained nor retracted, simply there, waiting. The pattern. The investigator's story is fictional, constructed for this narrative, but the pattern it describes is not fictional. It is drawn from the actual work of actual researchers who have spent years trying to understand what became of MKUltra and the knowledge it generated. What they have found, consistently, is not a smoking gun. What they have found is a pattern. And patterns, in the absence of direct evidence, are both the most compelling and the most frustrating form of historical argument, because they suggest something without proving it, and their significance depends entirely on interpretation. The pattern looks like this: classified research programs with goals that significantly overlap with MKUltra's. Behavioural modification, psychological influence, interrogation enhancement, memory manipulation appear in the historical record throughout the 1970s, 1980s and 1990s. Some of them have been declassified and are publicly known. Others appear in redacted documents where the operational details have been removed but the existence of the program cannot be entirely concealed. Others are referenced obliquely in correspondence between officials who knew that what they were discussing could not be committed to paper in explicit terms. None of this proves that MKUltra continued, but it establishes, clearly and without serious contestation, that the questions MKUltra was asking continued to be asked, that the institutional appetite for psychological influence research did not disappear, that the knowledge generated by the program did not simply evaporate when the documents were shredded. Knowledge, unlike paper, cannot be destroyed. Act 6. The final theory, the silent evolution. The most sophisticated version of the MKUltra continuation theory does not argue for a simple linear extension of the original program. It argues for something more complex and in many ways more troubling, an evolution. The theory holds that what began as direct physical experimentation on individual human subjects gradually transformed, over the course of decades, into something that operates at an entirely different scale and through entirely different mechanisms. That the transition from the 1950s and 60s to the present was not a break but a development, a maturation of the same underlying project, adapted to the tools and contexts available at each stage of its evolution. In the early years, the tools available were chemical and psychological: drugs, isolation, conditioning. These tools required direct access to subjects, which made the program both powerful and constrained. You could only experiment on people you had physical access to. The scale was inherently limited by logistics. As behavioural and cognitive science developed through the 1970s and 1980s, the tools became more refined. You could study how people made decisions. What factors influenced their beliefs? What psychological states made them receptive to particular kinds of information? And you could study these things through legitimate academic research, through controlled experiments with consenting subjects, without the legal and ethical catastrophe of direct covert experimentation. The knowledge accumulated, the techniques became more precise, and then, in the 1990s and beyond, the digital revolution changed everything. Suddenly, the question of scale dissolved entirely. You no longer needed physical access to a subject to study them. You no longer needed a laboratory or a controlled environment. The data that people generated simply by living their digital lives, what they searched for, what they read, who they talked to, what they bought, what they believed, was available in quantities that would have seemed fantastical to Sidney Gottlieb in 1953. The theory suggests that an intelligence community that had spent 40 years developing sophisticated psychological influence techniques was not simply going to ignore those capabilities when they became suddenly and dramatically more powerful. That the transition from MKUltra's methods to the digital age was not an abandonment of the underlying project but a scaling up of it, a move from individual manipulation to population-level influence made possible by technologies that did not exist when the program began. Less visible, more scalable, more deniable. And in those qualities, the theory argues, lies the reason it has never been exposed in the way that the original MKUltra was exposed, because there is no single program to expose, no single laboratory to raid, no single set of documents to declassify. There is only a continuous practice, distributed across institutions and technologies and decades, that has become so deeply embedded in how power operates that it would be almost impossible to point at it and say, there, that is where it begins and ends. Why it would stay hidden. If such a program existed today, if the impulse that created MK Ultra had truly never ended, only changed its form, why would it remain hidden? The answer to that question is perhaps the simplest part of this entire story. Because the alternative is unacceptable, not just politically, not just legally, but fundamentally at the level of what it would mean for the relationship between a government and the people it governs. A government that systematically attempts to influence the psychological states of its own population, its beliefs, its perceptions, its decision-making, without that population's knowledge or consent is not, in any meaningful sense, a democratic government. It is something else. Something that has retained the forms and the language of democratic governance while abandoning the substance of it. And that is a truth so corrosive, so fundamentally threatening to the legitimacy of the institutions involved, that the institutions themselves would have the strongest possible motivation to ensure it was never clearly stated. The other reason it would stay hidden is simpler and more human. The people who would be responsible for revealing it are people who exist within the systems that would be implicated by the revelation. Whistleblowers require not just courage, but a belief that the revelation will matter, that someone will listen, that there will be consequences, that the sacrifice will be worth it. And in a world where the public has already processed the original MK Ultra and largely moved on, where the church committee hearings are historical curiosities rather than living wounds, there is less reason than ever to believe that another exposure would produce lasting change. So it stays hidden, not through a single act of deliberate concealment, but through 1,000 small acts of institutional self-protection, bureaucratic inertia, and the simple human preference for not knowing what is inconvenient to know. Epilogue. The program that disappeared officially, MK Ultra, ended decades ago. The records were destroyed, the investigations concluded, the officials testified, the senators nodded, and the curtain was drawn. Case closed. Program terminated. Nothing more to see here. And yet, the questions persist, not because conspiracy theorists refuse to accept the official record, but because the official record is incomplete by design. Because a record that was deliberately destroyed cannot be used to establish that nothing lay beyond its edges. Because the institutional logic that created MK Ultra, the belief that psychological influence is a strategic asset, that the manipulation of human perception is a tool of power, that the boundary between foreign and domestic operations is a formality to be respected only when convenient, that logic did not end with the program. We live right now in an era in which the psychological manipulation of populations at scale is not only possible but routine. Advertising has always done something like this, of course. But the sophistication, the granularity, the individualization of modern influence operations, commercial and political and potentially governmental, represent something qualitatively different from what came before. The ability to know, with considerable precision, what a specific person is afraid of, what they desire, what they believe, what makes them angry or hopeful or compliant, and to use that knowledge to nudge their perceptions in a chosen direction. This is not science fiction. It is the present. The question MK Ultra forces us to ask is not whether this kind of influence is happening. It is who is doing it, under what authority, and with what oversight. And the honest answer to that question, the answer that emerges when you look at the available evidence with clear eyes and no predetermined conclusion, is that we do not fully know what was learned in those classified laboratories before the files were shredded, what continued under different names and different funding lines in the decades after the official termination. What knowledge, carefully gathered and never published, informed the development of the digital influence infrastructure that shapes so much of our information environment today? We cannot answer these questions definitively. The evidence that would allow us to answer them was, by design, destroyed. And so we are left where the best historical mysteries always leave us, in the space between what can be proven and what cannot be ruled out, in the gap between the official story and the full truth. MK Ultra, the official record tells us, ended, but the official record was written by the people who destroyed the documents that would have told us what really happened. And that is perhaps the most important thing to remember as you close your eyes tonight, as the world outside grows quiet and your thoughts begin to slow, and the ordinary mystery of consciousness, of who you are, of what you believe and why you believe it, of what shapes the quiet architecture of your inner life, settles around you like water finding its level. Someone, once, thought that architecture could be engineered, that the private room of a person's mind could be entered, rearranged and exited without leaving a visible trace. They spent 20 years and millions of dollars trying to prove they were right, and then they destroyed the evidence of what they found. Sleep well, sleepy koala army. And remember, whatever you dream tonight, whatever thoughts visit you in the quiet hours between waking and sleep, they are yours. They have always been yours. At least that is what they want you to believe. Good night. Afterword. What the record shows. For those of you who find it difficult to simply let this one go, and I understand completely if you do, let me leave you with a few documented facts. Not theories, not speculation. Things that are established on the record and verifiable through public sources. It is a fact that the United States government conducted non-consensual psychological and pharmacological experiments on its own citizens for a period of at least 2 decades. It is a fact that those experiments caused lasting harm to an unknown number of people, because the records were destroyed before the full subject list could be reconstructed. It is a fact that the destruction of those records was ordered by the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. It is a fact that the official investigation into MK Ultra was conducted using only the small fraction of documents that survived that destruction by accident. It is a fact that the United States government has, at various points since the 1970s, conducted classified behavioural research programs whose full contents remain unknown to the public. It is a fact that American intelligence agencies have used psychological profiling, behavioural analysis, and targeted information operations both domestically and abroad, and that the legal and ethical frameworks governing those operations have been inconsistently applied and rarely subjected to meaningful independent oversight. It is a fact that the questions MK Ultra was asking: how do you change what a person believes? How do you make someone do something they would not otherwise choose to do? How do you shape perception at scale? Are questions that have grown more answerable, not less, with the passage of time and the development of technology. None of these facts constitute proof that MK Ultra itself continued, but they establish something important. The impulse behind it did not disappear. The desire to understand and to use psychological influence as a tool of power is not a relic of the Cold War. It is an enduring feature of the landscape in which power operates, and enduring features of landscapes tend to find expression, regardless of whether the specific program that once gave them expression has been officially terminated. History is not a series of events that begin and end cleanly. It is a continuous flow of cause and effect, in which the things that are officially terminated have a habit of leaving shadows that outlast them. MK Ultra cast a long shadow. How long that shadow actually extends, whether it reaches all the way to the present, or whether it faded sometime in the 1970s when the documents were shredded and the curtain fell, is a question that the evidence, in its current state, cannot definitively answer. But the shadow is there. It has always been there. And it is worth knowing that it exists, worth carrying the awareness of it as you move through a world full of information and influence and systems that have strong interests in shaping what you think and feel and choose. That awareness is not paranoia. It is not the territory of people who wear foil hats and distrust their neighbours. It is the reasonable, historically informed recognition that institutional power has a long record of pursuing its interests in ways that are hidden from the people, most affected by those interests. And that knowing this, sitting with this, taking it seriously, is one of the most important things a thoughtful person can do in an era when the tools available for psychological influence have never been more powerful, more subtle or more difficult to detect. MK Ultra happened. That is not in question. The only questions that remain are what we learned from it, what we chose not to learn from it, and whether the lesson that power took from its exposure was truly one of restraint, or simply one of concealment. Sleep well, think clearly, and never stop asking the questions that make the comfortable uncomfortable.